My grandmother never heard about greenhouse gas intensity or decarbonization for that matter. She would have looked at me with suspicion if I'd tried to explain it. But she knew a few things. Does it work? Who pays for it? What happens when it gets expensive? She knew that you don't throw away good cooking oil. Here she is. She's the little one, by the way. You strain it, you keep it, you reuse it. She knew that if something grows in the ground, it can feed or heat your house. She knew that waste is just a resource that nobody's bothered to think about yet. I have spent 20 years on trading floors across Europe and Asia Pacific, trading mostly renewables. And everything I have learned about what works in the energy transition, my grandmother already understood. Without a single acronym, without a fancy consultant. She just paid attention. And here's what I want to share with you today. We live in an era that is obsessed with inventing the next big thing. But in my industry, maritime decarbonization, the solutions that work at scale, they are not new. They come from traditional agricultural knowledge, from community-level waste management, from practices that have existed for generations. The most effective sustainability isn't invented, it's rediscovered. And if we paid more attention to what was already there, we'd waste a lot less time chasing what isn't. Let me show you what I mean. The European Union has created a regulation called FuelEU Maritime. It requires every ship that sails to European ports to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. If you don't comply, you pay a penalty. About 2,400 euros per ton of fuel equivalent, which is 4 times what the fuel costs now. For a shipping company with a large fleet, that's millions of euros. It becomes existential very quickly. Now, how do you comply? That's where it gets tricky. You need to work out meter-long formulas full of Greek letters, greenhouse gas intensity calculations, well-to-wake emissions factors, pooling mechanisms where compliant ship can trade surplus with non-compliant ones. Yeah, I know I've lost you already. You're not the only one. Imagine the workload. I'm not even talking about traceability scheme. Imagine the workload to trace feedstock origin back to the field where it grew or the restaurant where it was fried. I'm not telling you this to impress you with complexity. I'm telling you this because the people this system is designed to help, ship owners, fleet operators, procurement managers, but they can barely navigate it. I've watched senior executives at shipping companies. They look at compliance dashboards the same way my grandmother would look at a smartphone. Not because they're not smart, but because we've built a system that excludes more than it includes. We took a perfectly simple idea, use cleaner fuel for ships, and turn it into a regulatory labyrinth. We created a language full of signs, acronyms that work less as a communication and more as a gate. If you know the acronyms, you're inside. If you don't, good luck. And frankly, sometimes, even if you do, good luck. And that's what strikes me the most. The cleaner fuels at the center of all this complexity, they are not complex at all. They're primarily biodiesel, made from animal fat, used cooking oil, any other organic waste. Basically, everything that is sticky and smelly and would otherwise end up in a gutter, or even worse, in animal feed. These are not revolutionary molecules from a high-tech lab. These are plants, oils, animals' fat. Things humans have used for thousands of years. Did you know that the first diesel engine actually ran on vegetable oil? That was back in 1893. That's something my grandmother would cook with. So we wrapped an ancient solution into a modern language so complicated that most people can't see the solution anymore. They can only see the language. Singapore, without realizing it, is one of the best examples of ancient intelligence feeding into a modern system. Every night, thousands of hawker centers, restaurants across the island, they all produce used cooking oil. Collectors, often family businesses, some operating for the same routes for decades, they pick it up from there. It goes to processing facilities. It gets cleaned, refined, esterified, and it becomes marine biofuels. Esterification is a process so simple that we could do it on the table here with just 2 cups, one with the oil, one with methanol, and we just mix them and we're done. So imagine a ship bunkering in Singapore that burns it on its way to Rotterdam. Somewhere in a Brussels database, a compliance deficit gets settled. Think about that chain for a moment. A chicken rice style in Lau Pa Sat, like this one. A container vessel's fuel tank. A EU regulatory portal. All connected. Not by a consulting strategy deck. Not by a top-down policy design. But by a community-level practice of not wasting what has value. That practice is older than any of us here in the room. And the same pattern repeats across Southeast Asia. Palm oil cultivation in Indonesia and Malaysia, and I need to be honest here, that is a controversial feedstock, and I hear the complaints. Deforestation, land use change, biodiversity loss, they are all real problems. Pretending they don't exist would be hollow optimism, the sort that makes me distrust conference keynotes. Biofuels industry has sins to account for, and the way we have developed some of these supply chains. But, and this matters, agricultural knowledge behind sustainable palm cultivation is generations deep. Small farmers understand soil composition, seasonal cycles, and yield patterns in ways that no satellite imagery can fully capture. Their expertise, when practiced responsibly, is the foundation of the global biodiesel supply chain. Without them, no FuelEU, no compliance, not in theory, in practice. Or take an even older example, one that sits at the very heart of shipping itself. Humans have used wind to move goods across oceans for at least 3,000 years, from Greek merchant ships to tea clippers in the 19th century. Sails were the backbone of the global trade, long before anyone thought to burn anything to power ships. Then steam came, then diesel, and by 1940, the sailing merchant fleet was gone. We forgot. And now, as the cost of emission rises, regulations tightened, the industry is remembering. Today, wind-assisted propulsion systems are being filled on commercial ships. Rotor sails, rigid wind sails, even giant kites. Over 100 vessels like these are operating. Another 120 are being built. They deliver, on average, 20% fuel saving compared to conventional vessels. Peaks that go even above 30% in good wind conditions. FuelEU Maritime even grants a reward factor for those ships who use them. Think about that for a second. The shipping industry spent a century and a half replacing sails with engine. And now, it's splitting back sails onto the same ships. It turns out that free, zero-emission energy was there all along, blowing across the same trade routes it always has. These aren't primitive ideas, waiting to be improved by modern science. These are systems refined over centuries by people who didn't have the luxury of getting it wrong. When your survival depends on the ecosystem you manage, you learn fast, you learn for real, and you pass that knowledge down. Not in a PDF, not in a compliance framework, but in practice, in stories, in the way you teach your children how to work the land. My industry loves to talk about circular economy as if it were a breakthrough concept. But guess what? It's not. It's what my grandmother did every day. It's what hawker center oil collectors do every night. It's what small farmers across the region have done for generations. We just gave it an English name and a conference circuit. Now, I can already hear reasonable objection, and it's a fair one. Traditional knowledge alone doesn't solve climate change. You can't power a global shipping fleet on grandmother wisdom and good intentions. I agree. We need regulation. We need technology. We need capital markets and compliance frameworks. And yes, even sometimes we need those boring acronyms. That's true. I'm not arguing we go back to pre-industrial world. I have spent my career in the regulatory machine. I know it's necessary. But here's what I've learned in 20 years in the market. The solutions that survive economic pressure are never the most sophisticated. They're the most grounded. And by grounded, I mean they have roots in something that is much older than the last innovation cycle. I've watched wave after wave of those fancy future fuels announced with great fanfare. Hydrogen power ships, e-fuels, you name it. Every conference has a new darling. Every year there's a new one. Slides are beautiful. Timelines are ambitious. Pilot projects get press coverage. But when it comes to reality check, regulation gets delayed, or economics simply don't work at scale. Mostly because the supply infrastructure is too costly to build. And the shiny solution quietly disappears from the agenda. Meanwhile, biodiesel from used cooking oil and animal fat keeps moving, quietly, unglamorously, something that people have practiced for a very long time. The supply chain is real, the feedstock is available. The economics, while it's true they're not always easy, are grounding in something tangible. Green policy is often the first thing that gets sacrificed when real economic pressure hits. I watched it happen in 2022, when most countries slashed biofuel mandates to contain energy costs after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I watched it happen before. I will watch it happen again. Let's see what happens by the end of this year if prices remain as high as they are now. The promises made at climate conference, they evaporate the moment electricity bills double. That's the end of the world versus the end of the month. What does remain? The knowledge forged in communities that have managed resource sustainability for centuries. Not because a regulation told them to, but because their survival depended on it. So, here's what I ask every one of you in this room, especially those of you about to step into leadership roles. You over there, you, everyone basically. Before your next strategy meeting about sustainability, before you open the next slide deck about the future of your industry, try something. Try to explain the way you'd explain it to your grandmother. That's challenging. Someone with common sense, practical experience, someone who doesn't know anything about your field. If the plan doesn't hold up under that conversation, if it only makes sense inside the language of your industry, then it's not ready. And it probably won't survive their first real crisis. The best decision I've seen in energy transition, they weren't the most clever ones. They were the most honest ones. They asked, what actually is available today? What survives when subsidy disappears? What still works if the political wind changes direction? Those questions don't come from innovation labs. They come from the same place my grandmother's instinct came from, a deep, practical understanding of how things actually work. And the second thing I'd like you to try, when you look at solutions, look down before you look forward. The most valuable ideas in your industry might not be the newest ones. They might be hiding in traditional practices, in local supply chains, like this guy, in the way communities have solved problems for generations, without anyone writing a white paper about it. Pay attention. to what's already there. That's where the real gems are. And they've been overlooked for far too long. My grandmother passed away some years ago, but I think about her quite often when I'm sitting in a meeting watching someone present a slide deck about the future of energy. I think of her when I can feel in my gut that the numbers won't survive the contact with reality. She wouldn't have needed a slide deck. She would have asked again these 3 questions. Does it work? Who pays for it? What happens when it gets expensive? Those 3 questions. No acronyms, just ancient wisdom. The thing I wish I'd understood 20 years ago, instead of learning it slowly, deal by deal, crisis by crisis, is that the most powerful knowledge isn't always the newest. Sometimes it's the oldest. Sometimes it's the thing your grandmother knew all along. Thank you.